and authority. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body. The church is he is the beginning of the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have this supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
And in him all things hold together. Someone have Colossians 2.
That their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding in the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. For though I am absent in body, yet I am with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and the firmness of your faith in Christ. Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority.
So in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And what David shared is that you're studying the book of God's works as well as the book of God's words, correct? The book of Revelation, the book of nature, the two books that God has written. This is the era that the Reformation was coming out of. Anybody know what this painting refers to? Yes?
Is this the religious wars?
No, not religious wars. Peasants' uprising. Why were all these people dying? Half of Europe's population wiped out. About 50%. Yes, the Black Death, which is the bubonic plague, and in the 1300s was when it was the worst. So about 200 million people died across Europe and Asia, and at that time no one had any idea. It was God's wrath, it was an imbalance of the humors, it was something bad in the air. Nobody knew what was causing the plague. All they knew was that every other person was dying. So the triumph of death was very much in the forefront of everyone's consciousness in this era. Okay. My background is in infectious diseases, so we go to medical school for 4 years, then we go to residency for a minimum of 3 years. After that, we are board certified and licensed physicians to practice, but we can go on and do a fellowship. So I did a fellowship in infectious diseases at UC San Francisco's Fresno campus, and then stayed on as faculty. So infectious diseases, study of infections, whether caused by viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungus, yeast, and how to prevent them, how to treat them. So this is going to be the focus of my talk, but we'll hopefully tie it in and see how it works. And we're going to start out big and then get smaller and smaller. So the Black Death was caused by a microbe, a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Yersin was the scientist who discovered it in the late 1800s at the Pasteur Institute in France. And he characterized this little bacteria that actually lived inside the body of a flea. The fleas carried the plague, and they lived on the bodies of rats. And then the rats transferred the fleas to humans, to cats, to dogs, to all other mammals, and there was this widespread decimation across Europe, and the ships would carry the rats as well wherever they went as they conquered the rest of the world, and they would spread the plague. So it was all in this little bacterium. Yes? how would the bacteria be transferred to humans? Because fleas jump and fleas bite. And if a flea doesn't find a mouse or a rat or a cat to bite, it bites us. And then through its saliva, the bacteria is transmitted into the human bloodstream. And then people can transmit it because once they get the plague, the infection, they get boils on their skin, they get pneumonia, they die a very bloody death. And when you cough, also you can spread the bacteria in your secretions. Okay. But none of this was known. It was just God's judgment, the Black Death. So we'll start with Galileo. Even though he was not a biologist, he was not someone I've ever studied beyond what you've probably studied in high school level science. And he was an Italian astronomer, so not biologist. Lived in the 1500s to early 1600s. 4 moons revolving around it, and many more stars than were visible to the naked eye. Then he wrote this famous book, Dialogue Concerning the 2 Chief World Systems, the Ptolemaic and the Copernican. And he questioned the geocentric worldview. So does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? This was heresy to even suggest something like that. Everybody knew that the sun and all the planets revolve around the Earth, correct? The Earth is the center of the cosmos. How dare you question it? But he was brought before the Pope and denounced as a heretic and condemned to life imprisonment, so he died under house arrest. So the Greeks and the Romans believed that these were gods and goddesses. Mercury, also known as Hermes to the Romans, Venus, known as Aphrodite, Mars, known as Apollo, Zeus, known as Jupiter. The Greeks and the Romans had the same had names for the same gods. So, are they gods and goddesses, or are they planets that we can study, that we can name, that we can characterize? We can say, this is how it orbits. This is how many moons this has. Are they gods and goddesses to be worshipped, feared, sacrificed to? So he was challenging their paradigm. On the one with the wings is Mercury, and then this lady is Venus, and she's bowing before Mars, the god of war. Venus was the goddess of love, and Mercury was considered the winged messenger of the gods. Okay, so they had elaborate stories revolving around all the gods and many subplots. But Galileo's belief that philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. So Psalm 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. So Galileo said, the book, the universe, cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. And what language is it written in? Written in the language of mathematics, its characters and triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. So in order to understand the universe, you need to understand math. In order to understand God's works, you need to understand math. So he said, in questions of science, the authority of 1,000 people is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. Mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended for us to forego their use, meaning we love the Lord with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Yes? The Bible shows us the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. So he had a counterpart, same city, Pisa in Italy, who was a Jesuit Italian doctor in the 1600s, and who disproved a superstition that was the prevalent theory of the day, the idea of spontaneous generation, that even the most brilliant scholars of Europe believed at that time, that maggots and flies arise spontaneously out of rotting meat. So you all know, when you're at a picnic, my 4-year-old son knows, you shoo away the flies, right? Our mother taught us very well. Shoo away the flies. Close the door when you come in so that flies don't enter your kitchen. Yes? Keep your food covered. But nobody knew that. It seems so basic to us that a toddler knows it. But in the 1600s in Europe, nobody knew that flies are what lay eggs in meat. So he did a very simple experiment. It's so simple, it's laughable. But it was revolutionary, and it was just as revolutionary as Galileo's thoughts, Galileo's theories, that if you have an open container and you leave it open to the air, the flies are going to land on the meat eventually and lay eggs, and soon you'll have maggots. We've witnessed this in the hospital. We have patients come in with wounds on their legs, rotting ulcers between their toes, or they're diabetics, and you open the bandage and maggots fall out. Sometimes the maggots have matured into flies and the flies fly out. But we know that those flies did not generate spontaneously out of that patient's foot. We know that there was a fly that crawled in and laid an egg there, and the patient was not aware. These are usually homeless people. It's very sad. So he sealed the container with cork, and lo and behold, there were no maggots. Even no matter how many days later, no maggots were found in the meat. He also covered another container of meat with a cloth, and flies landed on top of the cloth because they could smell the meat. They laid their eggs on top of the cloth. You could see a few days later maggots that hatched out of those eggs, but the meat itself had no maggots. Very simple, ridiculously simple, we think, but revolutionary, because since Aristotle's time, 300 years before Christ, he had first proposed the theory of spontaneous generation, that life can be born out of rotting meat, because this is what the Egyptians believed too. When the Nile flooded, frogs crawled out of the mud every year. So mud gave birth to frogs. So getting a little smaller now, Robert Hooke. He was the son of an Anglican clergyman who lived in 1653 to 1703. He was one among many children, and his parents had so many children, no one actually expected him to survive because he was one of the sickly runts. So they didn't pay much attention to him, didn't give him much of an education. He was noted to have a good ability to draw, so he became an apprentice to someone who painted portraits for a living, and he was sent out to work with this guy. He ended up working with Robert Boyle, from whom we get Boyle's law. He was a famous chemist, and he also worked with Isaac Newton, who developed the theory of gravity, understood the laws of gravity, physicist. He turned Galileo's telescope inside out. So Galileo was looking up at the stars, and Robert Hooke took a magnifying glass and began to look down. So that's created the microscope. He wrote this. He published this book, Micrographia, by the Royal Society of London in 1665. And even though at this time the fleas had not been identified as the culprit of the Black Death, it was still a creature that God had made. So this is the magnification of a flea that he published in his book, 40 times larger than we could actually see it just with the naked eye. And even a flea, or a louse, or a housefly, is fearfully and wonderfully made by our Creator. And never before had anyone observed the natural world in so much detail. He was the first one to look at plants under his microscope as well, and he discovered that they have these tiny little structures inside. He took a cork and he sliced it in cross sections, and he looked at it under a microscope, and what he saw reminded him of cells inside a monastery. So he named them cells, the little rooms where the monks would live. He named them cells, and he laid the foundation of what we call cell theory, that all organ of cells and all cells arise from other cells. So you can see the housefly, the magnification. You can see the compound eyes of a housefly. Never before had it been understood that even a fly's eye is so marvelous. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. He was a Dutch haberdasher. Anybody know what a haberdasher is? No. They sell. They're merchants, and they sell things, items in their store with which you can make clothes. So buttons, needles, threads, cloth, zippers, ribbons. He was a Dutch haberdasher. He was not a learned man, not a biologist, not a scientist. But every haberdasher had a little magnifying glass with which he could inspect cloth. So look at the threads, the fibers. And he had the obsession to improve his magnifying glasses and create his own microscopes. The only book in his house was the Dutch Bible. He never learned Latin, which was the language of the academics, and he was laughed at, but he was so curious. So he would spend hours and days and months grinding his own glass lenses and perfecting his techniques to make microscopes for his own use, just because he wanted to see more. So he described for the very first time in a Drop of Rain's house these wee little, what he called animalcules. He said they're swimming in the water. They're jumping and leaping like pike, like fish or trout. Holland has a lot of canals and a lot of water surrounding. So he would go to the canals and look at all these drops of water. He was the first one ever to describe bacteria, yeast, red blood cells. So he would poke a needle into the fish's tail and see the capillaries, or you say capillaries, and red blood cells, sperm, algae, protozoa such as Giardia, which he examined in his own diarrhea and the diarrhea of other people. He was very, very curious. He scraped the plaque off his teeth. He said, I have this whitish substance on my teeth. Let me put a drop of that in some pure water and look at it under the microscope. And lo and behold, he found that the white stuff in his teeth was alive with bacteria, these little swimming creatures that were twisting and turning and diving. And he wrote in Dutch 560 letters to the Royal Society of London describing his findings. And they laughed at him. He did not speak Latin or read or write it. So his letters had to be translated. So Galileo had made a rudimentary microscope, which then Robert Hooke improved upon, and Anthony van Leeuwenhoek improved upon further still. So these were all revolutionary ideas, but they were all laughed at. So skeptics abounded. What? They said, the Dutchman said he's discovered beasts so small that you can put as many of them into one little drop of water as there were people in his native country. What nonsense. But today he's known as the father of microbiology. He was a simple Dutch Reformed Calvinist. And again, the only book in his house was the Bible. He said there is this amazing diversity of life forms revealed under his microscope, which glorified God just as much as looking at stars through a telescope. Can someone read Psalm 139:17, please, and hold up your hand when you've reached it?
How precious are your thoughts about me, O God, they cannot be numbered.
How vast is the sum of them, yes? Doesn't the books go on to say, how precious are your thoughts, O God? How vast is the sum of them? No? Am I misquoting? Yeah. Yes, different translations. Someone have Genesis 1:11 and 12? Okay.
And God said, let the earth put forth grass, herbs yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, wherein is the seed thereof upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, herbs yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit, wherein is the seed therefore after their kind. And God saw that it was good.
Someone have verse 20 and 22.
And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas. The birds increase on the earth.
Can someone have verse 24 and 25?
And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good.
Thank you, Katie. Everything according to its kind. We'll see what that means in a second. So he asserted that all living things reproduce faithfully according to their kind. So he laid, again, another groundwork against the theory of spontaneous generation, because Aristotle, so this was now 1600s, and 300 years before Christ, Aristotle had proposed that life could arise from non-living material. This is what scientists believe today, by the way, that life can arise from non-living material. And this was the accepted theory, which persisted until the 17th century. So frogs appearing out of the mud in the Nile during the annual floods, mice appearing out of wheat. So you leave wheat in your pantry or on your barn for a few weeks, and lo and behold, mice will appear. They must have come out of the wheat itself, and maggots appearing out of meat. The same things they believed about scorpions, bees, lice, and worms. Everything could just pop up spontaneously. But he said, no, all living things reproduce faithfully according to their kind. They are created. So he said, from all these observations, we discern most plainly the incomprehensible perfection, the exact order, the inscrutable providential care with which the most wise Creator and Lord of the universe had formed the bodies of these animalcules, which are so minute as to escape our sight, to the end that different species of them may be preserved in existence. So not all those little creatures under his microscope looked the same. They were very unique. They all had a unique fingerprint. This must surely convince all of the absurdity of those old opinions that living creatures can be produced from corruption of putrefaction. Putrefaction just means rotting or decay. This must appear wonderful, and it must be a confirmation of the principle that all living creatures deduce their origin from those which were formed at the beginning. So this was him demonstrating his microscope to the Queen of England, Catherine, the wife of King Charles. He refers over and over in his letters in the Royal Society of London to God's handiwork as the divine artist, the creator, the sustainer, the Lord of the universe, the truth. And he says it is for us to consider his perfect workmanship. It is to be hoped then that the inquirers into nature's works, by searching deeper and deeper into her hidden mysteries, will more and more place the discoveries of the truth before eyes of all, for as to produce aversion to the errors of former times, which all those who love truth ought diligently to aim at. For we cannot in any better manner glorify the Lord and Creator of the universe than that in all things, however small they appear to our naked eyes, we contemplate the display of his omniscience and his perfections with the utmost admiration. So these are sketches of his red blood cells that he found in the capillaries of fish. And now we know obviously that red blood cells carry oxygen and deliver oxygen through hemoglobin to all the tissues of the body. None of that was known, but it's still worthy of being described. Lazzaro Spallanzani, he was also an Italian Jesuit priest in the 1700s, 1729 to 1799, and he said this too: life only comes from life. Microbes must have parents. Who are these bacteria's parents? They must have a father and a mother. There must be law and order even to the birth of the tiniest life forms in the science of animals, just as there is in the workings of the stars. So he didn't just argue against the fashionable theory of the vegetative force. So there was spontaneous generation and there was vegetative force, this mysterious force that could make little animalcules arise from mutton gravy. That's what people believed. If you set a bowl of gravy out, mutton gravy, soon enough you'll find creatures living in it. But he set about to disprove it with facts and experiments. So the biographer in this book, it's called Microbe Hunters, said the vanity of his ideas must bow to the hard clearness of facts. He didn't argue with words at his desk against those who believed in the vegetative force, but he said, I'm going to do experiments at my lab bench with flasks and microscopes. So what a true scientist does is test a hypothesis. We don't just invent preposterous theories, because those clutter up the hard job of getting genuine new facts from nature. We have to test what we believe. So mutton gravy or yeast soups, when they were boiled and sealed in flasks, did not produce microscopic life forms. He was able to isolate single bacteria and look at them under the microscope and see how they divided and how they multiplied and reproduced. He went on to study electricity in fish, sonar echolocation in bats. This is what the military uses. And we use the same technology that God has created in nature. He studied the reproduction of amphibians, and he also did the first successful artificial insemination in dogs. So this was Francisco Redi on the left, who demonstrated that the maggots were offspring of flies, not products of spontaneous generation. In the middle was John Needham, who was a British philosopher, not a scientist, but he proposed that mutton gravy in itself can create life if you leave it out long enough. And then Spallanzani on the right, who said no, if you cover your mutton gravy, it's not going to produce life. If you boil it, correct? Sterilize. So every biologist knows about Louis Pasteur. Is the name familiar to any of you? Some of you have heard. You 1895. And he began with this question: how does barley change into beer? If we take beets or potatoes, how does it produce sugar? And with that sugar, how do we get alcohol? And even if you break that alcohol further, how do you get vinegar? So no chemist in the world at that time knew anything about fermentation. So he was a missionary in the cause of microbes. The world must know, because he looked at the beer under the microscope. He looked at the foam that arose on the top layer. The world must know, and the people of this world must gasp at the astounding news that millions of gallons of wine in France and boundless oceans of beer in Germany are not made by men at all, but by incessantly toiling armies of creatures, 10 billion times smaller than a wee baby. Fermentation, so yeast. We know that yeast converts sugar, producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. The sugar that's found in the wheat. So he was asked to solve a problem because many people who were producing wine were producing sour wine. Their wine was spoiling. So they came to him with this question: can you help us? What's making the wine sick? So he looked at it and he discovered that wine that had turned sour had these little creatures swimming in it that good wine did not. What are these little creatures? Where do they come from? These little animals that turn milk sour in every can, and they turn butter rancid in every jar from Greenland to Timbuktu, the ones that are making the wine sick. They were producing the smell of sour milk. So he said, surely microbes had to have parents. Again, against the theory of spontaneous generation. He wrote these famous words in 1864, omne vivum ex vivo, life only comes from life. At that time, evolution was becoming a fashionable theory as well, that life had started in this primordial soup billions of years ago and unfolded through a stately procession of living beings until it gets to monkeys and then finally to men. So the new philosophers were saying there doesn't have to be a god to start the parade or run it, it just happened. But Pasteur said, no, life only comes from life. My philosophy is of the heart and not the mind alone, and I give myself up to those feelings of eternity that come naturally at the bedside of a cherished child. At those supreme moments, there is something in the depths of our souls which tells us that the world is more than a mere combination of events due to a machine-like equilibrium brought out of the chaos of the elements simply through the gradual action of the forces of matter. Meaning, there is more. The world is not just this random combination of events. So he developed pasteurization of milk, Louis Pasteur. So now you've heard of him, yes? Pasteurization. He boiled milk, he boiled urine, and he sealed it in flasks for up to 3 years, and it didn't go bad. Very simple. As long as there were no bacteria that could enter, the flasks were sealed, heated, swan-necked with very elaborate, long necks so that bacteria would get trapped in the necks. There would be no growth. So he said, I have dealt the doctrine of spontaneous generation a mortal blow through this simple experiment. So the pasteurization of wine was now became popular. He said, if you take the wine that's been fermented, heat it very gently, the wine will not become sick because you've killed off all bacteria, and you will seal it so that no new bacteria can enter. He was sure microbes cause diseases long before he knew anything about whether or not they cause disease. Yes? Yep, that's right. Yeah. So he said, just look at a vat of beer. You have just a tiny inoculation of yeast, and what gigantic things these infinitely tiny beings can do. The equivalent of a 200-pound man chopping 2 million pounds of wood in 4 days. These yeasts are turning these vats, giant vats of beer into, wheat and hops into beer. So that's how much, what great works they're doing. Then he was asked by his former mentor to come look at the silkworms in the south of France, because the silkworm industry was being affected. There was a large silkworm die-off. Pasteur said, I know nothing about worms, and which is true. He knew nothing about worms, nothing about the silk industry, but out of respect for his mentor, he went to southern France for 6 years, and he started to dissect silkworms under his microscope, and he found that the worms that were dying were not producing cocoons. From the cocoons is where we get silk. Yes, you know that. And they were dying before they even reached that stage. And as he looked under the microscope, he said they have these little greenish globules that are swimming around in their bodies. And he discovered parasites, the first discovery of parasites, which were spreading to healthy silkworms. Because if healthy silkworms fed on the same leaves where those diseased silkworms were eating, they feed on mulberry trees. If they fed on the same leaves, then the healthy silkworms would get sick as well and die off. And the cocoons would not form properly. So Pasteur said, "It is in the power of man to make parasitic maladies disappear from the face of the globe, if the doctrine of spontaneous generation is wrong, as I am sure it is." Correct? If you believe in spontaneous generation, there's no reason to study microbes. There's no reason to investigate diseases. Malaria is a parasite, the one that took your friend Jessie. Malaria is caused by a parasite. Here was the first discovery of parasites in the world. And he proposed this thing called germ theory, which there are tiny beings that are causing people to get sick. So he went from what's making the wine sick to what's making the worms sick, and he wanted to know what's making men sick. He said there was nothing strange about the thought of a tiny beast, no larger than the microbe of vinegar, getting into an ox or an elephant or a man and slaying him. So what is making men sick? Observe the thousand, he would do these, he was quite a showman, and he would have the room dark and have a projected ray of light. He would say, observe the thousands of dancing specks of dust in the path of a ray of light. The air of this hall is filled with these specks of dust. These thousands of little nothings that you should not despise, for sometimes they carry disease and death, typhus, cholera, yellow fever, and many other pestilences. So this was a theory. It wasn't, he had no proof just yet. He had a little detour because he was asked next, what's making the sheep sick? So the sheep and cows were dying in pastures across Europe, and nobody knew why. We're going to take a break from pasture right now in France and go to Germany. But David, do we need to take a break? It's 11. 5-minute break.
He is. It's great how he like marries both things together. Like he's with SCS. No, I'm not gonna lie. Fashion is good. Oh, he's running jump ups right down here. I was like, I gotta go. Massive stack. Balls like those, man. I don't even sit down. This Black Monday is a thing now.
All right, are we ready to go? Ready to dive in some more history? I love this stuff. I'm fascinated by it. It's God's world, or the book of God's works, and it's fascinating to see men and women who have gone before us that take their curiosity farther and farther and farther, and what they discover about the world that God made. So I just love this. I think it's such a, for me, it's such a refreshing. It's just refreshing. I just love it. I'm not a scientist, but I'm in awe of what our brothers and sisters have done before. So thank you so much, Anandit. Vishal, your daughter is doing a really good job. I love it. So I hope you're getting over your nervousness for us. We love celebrating people. Actually, is what we're really good. So we are celebrating, and thank you for all the work you put into this. This is great.
So let's recap where we started. Can you see this from back there? We talked about Galileo, Francisco Redi, Robert Hooke, Lazzaro Spallanzani, Leeuwenhoek. There won't be a test, don't worry. I'm just recapping what we talked about. Yeah. Pasteur and Koch, Robert Koch. So Italy, England, back to Italy, Holland, France, and now Germany. Okay? So all the areas that have been impacted by the Reformation in the 1500s. What is making sheep sick? He wanted to answer the question, Louis Pasteur wanted to answer the question of what's making men sick, but he had some detours along the way. So what's causing these flocks of sheep to die in pastures? And why do sheep in this pasture and goats finally keel over and die? Their blood turns black. They're having blood coming out of every orifice. They're having bumps and boils on their bodies. Whereas sheep and goats in this pasture and cows are healthy. So what is it about this pasture but not about that pasture? So very just curious minds. What is it? And we'll take a break from pasture because there was a German country doctor who was studying the same question. Robert Koch, so 1843 to 1910. And he was a doctor, but really wasn't really interested in what he did because he had no cure for it. So mothers would come saying, my baby has diphtheria, and he's saying what every doctor in Europe said, what can I do? I don't even know what causes diphtheria. Not even the finest physician in all of Europe or all of the wisest doctor in Germany doesn't know what's causing your baby to be sick. If I don't know what's causing it, how can I cure it? what did doctors know about the mysterious causes of diseases? So sheep, entire flocks, and then farmers who worked with those sheep were getting sick. Shepherds were getting sick, and wool sorters, the people who took the wool off those sheep and were handling it, were also getting sick of anthrax all across Europe. And for his birthday, his wife gave him a microscope, and so Robert Koch started to look at the blood of these dead animals under his microscope. And he said this blood had turned black. It was very disgusting. And in between house calls to go deliver babies in villages in the middle of the night, he would look under his microscope at drops of blood, and he said, I see strange little sticks, which were later called rods, and from where we got the word bacilli, because bacillus means rod, in the blood of these diseased sheep. And as they get longer, they form these tangled threads or strings. So this is what he saw. This didn't have a name. Now we call it Bacillus anthracis. But he was looking at animals that died of anthrax, and he described these little sticks and threads. He said, if I look at the blood of a healthy sheep, a healthy goat or a healthy cow, I won't find those little sticks. No rods found there. So what happens if I take a sliver of wood, I heat it up, so I sterilize it, I dip it in the blood of an animal that died of anthrax, and then I take a healthy mouse. I make a little cut in its tail, and I poke that splinter into the mouse's tail. What's going to happen? The mouse died. He would look at the mouse's blood under the microscope and see the same little sticks in the mouse's blood. So, those threads must be alive, and they must be what's killing the healthy mice. So then he would take the spleen. The spleen is an organ that lives behind your stomach on the left side. And he would take it from the dead mouse. It was jam-packed with these rods or little sticks. And he created his own little incubators. He would go to the local butcher shop. He would get ox eyes from freshly slaughtered oxen, and using the liquid from their eyes, and then keeping it at the mouse's body temperature in a sterilized glass, he was able to dip the sample from the spleen into his little incubator, and he would grow billions more of these murderous threads. And then he would take that one, and then he would take a little sample from this incubator, and then create another one, so get more fresh solution from the ox's eye, and keep it nice and warm, incubate it, and lo and behold, more of these little rods would grow in this one, and then he would take a little drop from here, and incubate it into a fresh solution again. He did this for 8 generations, and they would keep reproducing by the billions. And then he said, okay, I've done this now, I have 8 great-grandchildren of the original bacteria. Let me see what happens if I take this generation number 8 and I inoculate it back into another healthy mouse. And lo and behold, that healthy mouse died of anthrax. So he dissected the mouse. He saw it again in the mouse's blood. Same bacteria. Confirmation, identical to what he had seen first in the first dead cows and sheep. So he had no idea, even at the time, that he was working with live bacteria, live microbes, but he pursued his hypothesis in between delivering babies and giving prescriptions to mothers who didn't know what to do for their sick kids with diphtheria. He took healthy guinea pigs and healthy rabbits, and he did the same thing. It sounds grotesque, but there was no other way to prove that this anthrax bacteria could be transmitted and cause the same disease in other mammals. Then he discovered that anthrax in this field, the field looked healthy, but when certain cattle went and grazed at this pasture, they got sick, but cattle that grazed at this pasture didn't get sick. So he examined the soil, and he found that the bacteria, the anthrax bacteria, had formed spores So spores that were resistant to drying, to cold, to heat. And the minute they entered the body, the warm, living body of a healthy animal, they came out of that spore phase and they began to multiply by the millions again and cause disease. So certain fields had anthrax spores in the soil, and he was able to demonstrate that. He didn't tell his colleagues at the university that his microbes, I found the microbes that are causing anthrax. He showed them. He said, come see, come look under the microscope. Come see the anthrax bacteria. Come see their spores, which are like little beads or capsules. And come see my generations of dead mice, dead guinea pigs, dead rabbits, dead sheep, dead cows, and see the ones that are healthy. And so it was that Koch put a sword into the hands of men, with which began the fight, with which to begin the fight against their enemies, the microbes, their fight against lurking death. And so it was that he began to change the whole business of doctors from a foolish hocus pocus with pills and leeches into an intelligent fight. So remember, bloodletting was the common accepted practice. You didn't know what was wrong with your patient, but they must have bad blood. So why don't we put a whole bunch of leeches on you and let the leeches suck your bad blood out? Okay? Doctors didn't have anything else in their armamentarium to offer patients besides that. So he transformed this hocus pocus into an intelligent fight where science instead of superstition was the weapon. And he said, if you want to keep your other cattle sick, keep them healthy, keep them away from the sick cattle. Yes, and dispose properly of the dead carcasses. Keep them in a cold, dry place away from your healthy cattle. So he also developed for the first time the ability to photograph bacteria under the microscope to convince the world about these murderous bugs. So he said, people, seeing is believing for most people, yes? And so I'm not just going to tell them, I'm going to show them. I'm going to show them pictures of these bacteria as I see them under the microscope. He also developed the techniques of pure culture. This is all fundamentals in microbiology that we learn, and how to isolate a single colony of different species of germs. So here I have a streptococcus, here I have a staphylococcus, here I have a diphtheria, here I have an anthrax. They're all different bacteria according to their kinds. And then he turned his attention to the #1 killer that was then and still now the #1 leading infectious disease on the planet, which was tuberculosis. At that time it killed 1 in every 7 people on the planet. It was known as consumption.